They call me the Null. In a world where your worth is measured by the size of your wolf and the ferocity of your growl, I am a glitch in the system. I have no wolf. I have no scent. To my pack, I am a breathing mistake. A scholar who hides in dusty ruins because he's too weak to survive the moonlight. But they're wrong. I didn't lose my wolf. I traded it for something far older. While the alphas were busy practicing how to bite, I was learning how to speak. Not in the language of men, and not in the whimpers of wolves. I learned the language of the foundations of the earth. Today, the Silver Moon Pack tried to break me. They tried to force me into a mating bond with a man who treats omegas like livestock. They thought they could command me because I was wolfless. They're about to find out that when I speak, the world doesn't just listen. It obeys. The great library of the Silver Moon Pack was the only place I felt alive. And even there, I was an intruder. The air smelled of vanilla and ancient parchment, but it was constantly tainted by the heavy, aggressive musk of the alphas who patrolled the halls. I am Cyrus. To the world, I'm an omega who failed to shift. At 24, I should have a sleek silver wolf. Instead, I have books. My fingers are stained with ink instead of blood, and my eyes are sharp with knowledge instead of predatory instinct. Still digging through the trash, Null? I didn't have to look up to know who it was. Brandon. He was the Pack Alpha's youngest son, a brute with more muscle than brain cells and a scent that smelled like wet dog and arrogance. He dropped a heavy, mud-caked boot onto the ancient manuscript I was translating. I stayed silent, my heart ticking like a clock. Patience, Cyrus. Just a little longer. This book is written in a dead tongue, Brandon sneered, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. He let his alpha pheromones leak out, a thick, suffocating pressure designed to make omegas drop to their knees in submission. Why waste your time on things that don't exist? You should be focusing on your real duty. The Alpha Council has decided. Since you're useless for the hunt, you'll be mated to Lord Vance of the Ironbite Pack tomorrow. He needs someone to clean his boots and produce a few runts. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, but it wasn't fear. It was a cold, crystalline rage. Lord Vance was a known sadist. Sending me to him was a death sentence draped in a marriage contract. I am a scholar of the high tongue, I said, my voice quiet but steady. I am not a broodmare. Brandon laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. You're a wolfless freak. You don't get to choose what you are. Tomorrow you'll be claimed. And if you fight it, we'll break your leg so you can't run. An omega's only job is to obey an alpha's command. That's the law of nature. He ground his boot into the manuscript, tearing the 1,000-year-old paper. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a wolf breaking free. It was a dam bursting. For years, I had studied the Dragon Speaker texts, ancient scrolls that spoke of a power that existed before the first human ever shifted into a wolf. They called it the Ancient Voice. I had practiced it in the deep woods, whispering to the trees and watching them bow. I had never used it on a person. Get your foot off my book, I whispered. Or what? Brandon barked, his eyes flashing red. Command me? You don't even have a voice, Null. You're... Kneel. I didn't yell. The word didn't come from my throat. It came from the marrow of my bones. It was a sound that resonated at a frequency that shouldn't exist in a human body. The air in the library suddenly turned heavy, as if the oxygen had been replaced by lead. Brandon didn't just kneel. He hit the floor so hard his kneecaps cracked against the stone. His face slammed into the table, his eyes wide and bulging with a terror I had never seen before. He tried to growl, but his jaw was locked tight. His wolf, the beast he was so proud of, was whimpering inside him, paralyzed by a primitive fear. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. The sound was like thunder in the dead silence. Nature's law? I asked, looking down at the powerful alpha who was now trembling at my feet. You think you know nature? You are a dog, Brandon, and dogs should learn to stay. The news of what happened in the library spread like a wildfire. By the time I walked out into the courtyard, the entire Pack-High Guard was waiting for me. 50 alphas, the elite warriors of the Silver Moon Pack, all shifted or semi-shifted, their claws out and their fangs bared. At the center stood the Pack Alpha, Silas, his face twisted in a mask of murderous rage. "Cyrus!" Silas roared, his voice echoing off the mountain walls. "What did you do to my son? What dark magic are you practicing, you wolfless abomination?" I stopped in the center of the courtyard. I felt small. I was one man in a tunic, surrounded by monsters that could tear me apart in seconds. But the air around me was humming. I could feel the ley lines of the earth beneath my boots. I could feel the vibrations of their heartbeats, their breath, their very souls. "I did nothing but give an order," I said. My voice was calm, which seemed to infuriate them even more. "You used a witch's trick," Silas screamed. "Kill him. Rip the tongue from his head." The 50 alphas lunged. It was a wall of fur, muscle, and teeth, a literal tide of death coming for me from every direction. I closed my eyes. I took a deep breath, pulling the energy from the ground up through my spine. I opened my mouth, and this time, I didn't hold back. "Halt!" The word hit the courtyard like a physical shockwave. The stone floor cracked. The windows of the pack house shattered into a million pieces. The 50 alphas didn't just stop. They were frozen in midair for a fraction of a second before gravity slammed them down. It was as if an invisible hand had reached down from the sky and crushed them into the dirt. 50 of the most powerful warriors in the territory were pinned to the ground, gasping for air, their bodies refusing to move. They weren't just being physically held. Their minds were being bypassed. My voice had overridden their nervous systems. Silas was on his stomach, his face pressed into the mud, his fingers clawing uselessly at the earth. "What are you?" he wheezed, the words barely audible. "I am the one you tried to sell," I said, walking slowly through the field of fallen alphas. I felt a strange, detached coldness. "I am the scholar you mocked, and from this day forward, you will never tell me what I am again." The silence that followed was terrifying. The only sound was the heavy breathing of 50 broken warriors and the distant ringing of my own ears. Then the sky changed. The clouds above the valley didn't just drift. They swirled, pulled by a massive gravitational force. A dark shadow began to descend from the peaks. A fleet of black, sleek airships bearing the crest of the obsidian throne. My heart skipped a beat. King Alaric. He was the cursed king, the most powerful psychic alpha in the world. They said he didn't even need to speak to kill. His mind was a weapon that could melt brains and shatter wills. He was the reason the global war had ended. He had simply walked into the enemy's capital and turned their generals into mindless husks. He was also a seeker. He hunted for anomalies. And I had just set off a psychic flare that could be seen from space. One of the smaller ships descended, landing with a soft hiss in the middle of the ruined courtyard. The ramp lowered, and a squad of silent sentinels stepped out. Warriors who had had their ears removed so they couldn't be affected by sound-based powers. Then, he stepped out. Alaric was taller than any man I had ever seen. He was dressed in high-collared black silk and silver armor, his movements fluid and predatory. But it was his eyes that stopped my breath. They weren't yellow or red like a normal alpha's. They were a deep, swirling violet, glowing with a terrifying psychic light. He looked at the 50 alphas pinned to the ground. He looked at the cracked stone and the shattered glass. Finally, he looked at me. I felt it immediately, a probe, a sharp, invisible needle trying to enter my mind. I didn't even think. I just tightened my mental focus. Out! The word was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a mountain. Alaric flinched. His head snapped back as if I had struck him. A thin trickle of blood ran from his nose, and his violet eyes widened in genuine shock. No one had ever pushed him out of their head before. No one could. The silent sentinels immediately raised their weapons, but Alaric held up a hand. He wiped the blood from his lip with a black-gloved finger, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "So," Alaric said, his voice echoing directly in my mind, skipping my ears entirely. "The rumors were true. There is a dragon speaker left in this world." I stood my ground, though my knees were beginning to shake from the exhaustion of using the voice. "I am not a wolf of your kingdom, King Alaric. You have no jurisdiction here." Alaric laughed, and the sound was like the clicking of 1,000 locks. He walked toward me, stepping over the body of Alpha Silas as if he were a piece of roadkill. "Jurisdiction?" Alaric asked. "I am the king of the mind. Everything that thinks belongs to me. But you don't just think. You command the fabric of reality." He stopped 3 feet away from me. The pressure coming off him was immense. It wasn't the alpha musk of the Silver Moon brutes. It was a cold, cosmic void. It felt like standing on the edge of a black hole. "You're wolfless," Alaric noted, his eyes scanning me with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. "They treated you like garbage because you didn't have a beast. They didn't realize you were the master of the beast." "Get to the point, King," I said, my voice rasping. "The point is," Alaric said, leaning in, his scent of ozone and ancient rain filling my senses. "I have spent 30 years looking for someone who could survive a conversation with me without their brain turning to mush. I have spent my life as a god among insects." He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from my throat. "I don't want your pack, Cyrus. I want you. I want the voice that can make alphas kneel. I want the only mind on this planet that is loud enough to drown out my own." I looked into those violet eyes and felt a pull I couldn't explain. It wasn't the submission of an omega to an alpha. It was something else. A recognition. Two monsters finding each other in the dark. "And if I refuse?" I asked. Alaric's smile sharpened. "Then I will burn this pack to ashes just to hear you scream another command. But I think you've had enough of this dirt. You were born for a throne, not a library. Come with me, and I will show you what happens when the voice and the mind become one." I looked back at the Silver Moon pack, at the people who had mocked me, the man who had tried to sell me, and the ruins of the only life I had known. I turned back to Alaric and did something no one had ever done to the king. I didn't bow. I didn't kneel. I reached out and grabbed him by the collar of his expensive silk tunic, pulling him down to my level. "If I go with you," I whispered, my voice vibrating with power, "you don't command me. You don't own me. We are equals, or I will use my last breath to tear your kingdom down." Alaric's eyes flared with a violent, beautiful light. He didn't look offended. He looked obsessed. "I wouldn't have it any other way," he whispered back. As the airships began to rise, leaving the broken Silver Moon pack behind, I knew the world was about to change. The age of the wolf was over. The age of the voice had begun. The world looks different when you're looking down on it from a throne of clouds. As King Alaric's airship, a leviathan of black steel and violet energy, rose above the jagged peaks of my former home, I stood at the observation deck, my hands gripping the cold railing. Below me, the Silver Moon pack house looked like a child's toy discarded in the mud. The 50 alphas I had brought to their knees were nothing but tiny, dark specks, probably still struggling to regain control over their own limbs. I expected to feel a sense of triumph. I expected to feel the weight of my victory. But instead, there was only a hollow, buzzing vibration in the back of my skull. Using the ancient voice wasn't like shifting. It didn't use muscles. It used the soul. It felt as if I'd reached into the center of my own being and pulled out a handful of white-hot wire. "You're trembling." The voice didn't come through my ears. It resonated directly against the soft tissue of my brain, a cold, smooth caress that made the hair on my arm stand up. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The scent of ozone and rain-soaked earth preceded him. Alaric was standing behind me, his presence a physical gravity that pulled at my senses. "It's called a vocal hangover," Alaric said, his voice echoing in my mind. The dragon speaker texts are incomplete, but they all mention the same thing. To speak the language of creation is to burn the vessel that holds it. I finally turned to face him. He had removed his armored mantle, wearing only a high-collared black tunic that clung to the lean, powerful lines of his body. His violet eyes were dim now, flickering like dying embers, but the intensity in them hadn't faded. "You speak as if you've seen this before," I said, my voice still a rasping shadow of its usual self. "But you said I was the last one." "The last living one," Alaric corrected. He stepped closer, his height forcing me to tilt my head back. "My ancestors spent centuries hunting your kind. They feared the voice because it was the only thing that could bypass a psychic's shield. We can control thoughts, Cyrus. We can rewrite memories. But the voice controls the atoms themselves. You don't ask the mind to obey. You tell the universe to change." He reached out, his gloved hand hovering near my face. I didn't flinch. I watched him. He traced the line of my jaw without actually touching me, his psychic aura humming against my skin like 1,000 tiny needles. "They called you an Omega," he whispered, a dark amusement coloring his mental tone. "A Null. They saw a wolf that wouldn't come out and thought you were broken. They didn't realize the wolf was simply too terrified to share a body with a dragon." "I don't feel like a dragon," I admitted, the exhaustion finally starting to seep into my bones. "I feel like a man who just set his own blood on fire." Alaric's eyes flared. "Good. That fire is what will keep you alive in the obsidian spire. My court is not like your pack of barking dogs, Cyrus. They are vipers. They have been waiting for me to show a moment of weakness for 20 years. And bringing an Omega scholar back as my equal? That is the biggest target I could have ever painted on your back." The capital of the Obsidian Throne was not a city. It was a monument to order. Built entirely from dark, volcanic stone and illuminated by floating violet lanterns, it sat in the center of a vast, dead plain. There were no trees here, no green things, just iron, stone, and the terrifying efficiency of a kingdom ruled by a man who could hear his subjects' thoughts. As we dismounted the airship, I was met with a wall of silence. Thousands of people, alphas, betas, and omegas, stood in the streets, their heads bowed. They didn't cheer. They didn't whisper. They stood in a perfect, eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. "They're afraid of you," I whispered, my voice finally beginning to return. "They are disciplined," Alaric replied aloud this time. His voice was beautiful, rich and melodic, but it lacked the warmth of a living thing. "Fear is a messy emotion. It leads to rebellion. I prefer harmony." We walked toward the Great Spire, a tower that pierced the clouds like a needle of black glass. At the entrance, 6 high alphas waited. These were Alaric's generals, his Council of Shadows. They were the most powerful wolves in the kingdom, men and women who had conquered entire continents in Alaric's name. As we approached, their eyes immediately locked onto me. I felt their judgment like a physical weight. I was wearing Alaric's spare cloak, but beneath it, I was still the same wolfless scholar in a dusty tunic. My scent, or lack thereof, was a provocation to them. In their world, if you didn't smell like a predator, you were prey. "Sire," the tallest of them said, a woman with a scar running across her throat. "General Vane. The borders are secure. The Southern Coalition has retreated. But we were led to believe you were investigating a massive energy surge in the north. We did not expect you to return with a guest." She said the word guest the way someone would describe a piece of filth stuck to their boot. "Cyrus is not a guest," Alaric said, his voice dropping into that dangerous low register that made the air vibrate. "He is my counterpart. He will be housed in the royal wing. He has full access to the archives, the council chambers, and the throne. A ripple of shock went through the generals. Vane's eyes flashed a predatory red. Your Majesty, with respect, the boy has no wolf. He has no rank. To place an unranked Omega in the royal wing is an insult to the bloodlines that built this city. Alaric didn't answer with words. He simply turned his gaze toward Vane. The general suddenly gasped, her hands flying to her head. She collapsed to one knee, her face contorting in agony as Alaric's psychic power tore through her mental defenses. It lasted only 3 seconds, but when he released her, she was shaking, her eyes bloodshot. Rank is a concept for those who cannot defend themselves, Alaric said calmly. Cyrus defended himself against 50 alphas of the Silver Moon Pack. He made them crawl in their own filth with a single word. If any of you believe your bloodline makes you superior to him, I invite you to test him. He looked at me, a silent challenge in his eyes. He wasn't just defending me. He was setting the stage. He wanted to see if I would take the opening. I stepped forward, moving past Alaric. I looked at General Vane, who was still gasping on the floor. I didn't feel the need to use the voice. Not yet. I had spent years studying the psychology of alphas. I knew their weaknesses better than they did. You think my lack of a wolf is a weakness, General, I said, my voice cold and precise. But a wolf is just an animal. It's driven by hunger, by instinct, by the moon. I am driven by the word. Your wolf is a slave to your biology. My power is a slave only to my will. I leaned down, looking her in the eye. The next time you refer to me as a guest or a boy, I won't wait for the king to punish you. I will use the voice to tell your heart to stop beating. And because the universe obeys me, it will. Vane flinched. The other generals shifted uncomfortably, their bravado flickering. They looked at Alaric, expecting him to be offended by my arrogance. Instead, the king was looking at me with an expression that bordered on hunger. Obsidian and ancient books. It was a palace within a palace, and for the first time in my life, I was surrounded by luxury. There was a bath carved from a single piece of amethyst, bed sheets made of moon spider silk, and a balcony that overlooked the entire city. But it was a cage. I knew that. I spent the first 3 days in the archives. Alaric had kept his promise. I had access to everything. I found scrolls that had been lost for 3,000 years. I found maps of the old world before the Great Shift, when dragons ruled the skies and humans were their speakers. But as I read, I realized why the dragon speakers had vanished. It wasn't a war that killed them. It was the power itself. The voice was a bridge between the physical world and the void. Every time a speaker used a command, a piece of their soul was pulled into the void to pay the toll. Eventually, there was nothing left but a hollow shell. A null. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't born wolfless. My bloodline had been hollowed out over generations of using the voice. And I was the last one because I was the only one whose soul was still dense enough to ignite the spark. You've stopped eating. Alaric was standing in the doorway of the archives. He moved so silently it was impossible to hear him. I've been reading, I said, not looking up from the scroll. Why didn't you tell me the cost? The cost is why my ancestors hunted yours, Alaric said, walking into the room. He sat on the edge of the heavy oak table, his presence filling the space. They thought they were being merciful. They thought they were stopping a slow suicide. And you? I asked, finally meeting his gaze. Why did you bring me here? To watch me burn out like a candle? Alaric reached out and took the scroll from my hands, setting it aside. He took my hands in his. His skin was cold, but his grip was firm. I brought you here because I am burning out too, Cyrus. I froze. What? Psychic power is no different, Alaric whispered, his violet eyes swirling with a deep, hidden exhaustion. Every time I reach into a mind, I lose a piece of my own. I hear 10 million voices every day. I feel every scream, every lie, every hidden desire in this city. It is a cacophony that never ends. I am losing myself to the noise. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. But when you spoke in that library, when you used the voice, for the first time in 20 years, the voices in my head went silent. Your power is a command. It overrides everything. It gave me peace. I felt a surge of something I couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It was a terrifying, soul-deep connection. We were both dying from our own greatness. We were two stars collapsing into each other. You want me to be your silence, I breathed. I want us to be the anchor for each other, Alaric said. Your voice can quiet the world for me. My mind can hold your soul together when the voice tries to pull it apart. We are the only two people on this earth who can save each other. For a moment, the air between us was electric. The mate bond that wolves talked about was a pale, pathetic shadow of what I felt in that moment. It was a cosmic alignment. But the moment was shattered by a sudden, violent explosion that rocked the tower. The alarms began to blare, a high-pitched psychic whistle that made my teeth ache. "Sire!" a voice screamed from the hallway. It was one of the sentinels. "The High Alphas! They've breached the inner sanctum! They're using the Null fields!" Alaric stood up, his face transforming into a mask of pure, icy rage. Vayne. I should have turned her brain to ash when I had the chance. "Null fields?" I asked, standing up with him. "Ancient technology," Alaric hissed. "It dampens psychic waves. They think that if they can neutralize my mind, they can take the throne." "They forgot about me," I said. Alaric looked at me, his eyes softening for a fraction of a second. "Cyrus, you're exhausted. If you use the voice now, after what you've read..." "I'd rather die as a king than live as a slave," I interrupted. "Let them come." The doors to the archives exploded inward. General Vayne and the other 5 High Alphas stepped through the smoke. They were wearing heavy, lead-lined armor designed to deflect psychic probes, and in their hands, they carried Null staffs, devices that emitted a low-frequency hum that made Alaric stumble, his violet eyes flickering and fading. "It's over, Alaric," Vayne shouted, her voice distorted by her helmet. "The age of the cursed king ends tonight. We will return this kingdom to the strength of the wolf." She looked at me and sneered. "And we'll start by hanging your little pet from the spire." Alaric fell to one knee, blood beginning to leak from his ears. The Null fields were tearing at his psyche, creating a feedback loop that was agonizing to witness. He couldn't fight back. His greatest weapon had been turned into his greatest weakness. I stepped in front of him. I felt the hollow space in my chest, the void where my soul was being pulled. I knew that every word I was about to speak would shave years off my life. I knew the toll. But as I looked at General Vayne, at the arrogance, the cruelty, and the small-mindedness of a wolf who thought she could command a dragon, I didn't care. I filled my lungs with the smoke-filled air. I didn't reach for my wolf. I reached for the foundation of the earth. I reached for the stars. I reached for the silence that Alaric so desperately craved. Fall. The word didn't just vibrate the air. It shattered the Null fields instantly. The staffs in the general's hands disintegrated into fine black powder. The lead-lined armor crumpled as if it were made of paper, crushing the wolves inside it. Vayne and her conspirators were slammed into the floor with such force that the stone cracked in a perfect circle around them. But I didn't stop there. Strip. With a sickening sound of tearing fabric and breaking bone, the general's wolves were forced back into their human forms. The transformation was violent, agonizing, and permanent. I wasn't just commanding their bodies, I was commanding their essences. I was tearing the alpha out of them and leaving nothing but the null. The courtyard outside fell into a deathly silence. Thousands of people miles away felt the shockwave of the command. I stood in the center of the ruins, my chest heaving, my vision beginning to blur with red. I felt the void pulling at me, a cold, hungry mouth at the center of my being. I started to sway, my legs turning to lead. Before I could hit the ground, Alaric was there. The null fields were gone, and his power had returned with a vengeance. The air in the room was swirling with violet lightning. He caught me in his arms, his touch no longer cold, but burning with a desperate, frantic energy. "Cyrus! Cyrus, look at me!" His voice was back in my head, but it wasn't a caress anymore. It was a command of its own. He flooded my mind with his own life force, using his psychic energy to bridge the gaps in my hollowing soul. It was a dangerous, forbidden technique, a psychic transfusion. I gasped, my eyes snapping open. I saw Alaric's face, pale, terrified, and more beautiful than I had ever seen it. "You fool," he whispered, tears of blood running down his cheeks. "You almost went into the void. They were in the way." I wheezed, a weak smile touching my lips. Alaric looked at the broken, wolfless generals on the floor. He looked at the power I had unleashed. Then he looked back at me, and I saw the finality in his eyes. He wasn't just my protector anymore. He was my devotee. He picked me up in his arms, turning toward the balcony. The sun was beginning to rise over the obsidian city, casting a blood-red light over the silent thousands below. "Hear me," Alaric's voice boomed, amplified by his psychic power so that every soul in the kingdom heard it. "The High Council is dead. The old laws are ashes." He held me up, showing the world the man who had shattered the alphas with a breath. "You called him a null. You called him weak. But today, he has remade the world. From this day forward, Cyrus is not my mate. He is not my consort." Alaric knelt on the edge of the balcony, still holding me against his chest. "He is the voice of the throne, and if you do not bow to him, you will answer to the silence." As one, the thousands of people in the streets below dropped to their knees, not because Alaric commanded them, not because they were afraid, but because they had heard the voice. And they knew that God had finally come to the Obsidian Spire. The silence of the Obsidian Spire used to be a weapon of terror. Now, it is an act of worship. It has been 3 weeks since I stripped the high alphas of their wolves. 3 weeks since I stood on the balcony and felt the life force of King Alaric pouring into my empty veins. The city below is transformed. The people move with a quiet, frantic reverence, clearing their eyes whenever I pass. They don't see an Omega Scholar anymore. They see a living disaster draped in royal silk. But inside, I am a crumbling temple. Every morning I wake up and check my hands. I'm looking for the graying of my skin, the sign that the hollowing is progressing. Every time I used a command, I felt a piece of my history, a memory of my mother's face, the smell of the old library, the sound of my own childhood laughter, simply vanish. It's the price of the voice. I am trading my past for a future where no one can ever hurt me again. You're thinking about the void again. Alaric was sitting at his desk, his fingers pressed against his temples. He didn't look up, but his mind brushed against mine like a warm, violet flame. Ever since the battle in the archives, our minds have been tethered. I can feel his exhaustion. He can feel my hunger for the silence. "I'm thinking about the cost," I said, my voice now rich and steady, vibrating with a power I no longer have to struggle to find. "I am the voice of the throne, Alaric. But what happens when the voice has nothing left to say? What happens when there's no more Cyrus left to pay the toll?" Alaric stood up. He moved across the room in that fluid, predatory way of his, stopping only when he was inches from me. He reached out and took my face in both hands. The psychic connection between us flared, a surge of energy that felt like a physical heartbeat. "I told you," he whispered, his violet eyes burning with an intensity that made the room grow cold. "I am your anchor. My mind is a reservoir of 1,000 years of history. If the void takes a memory from you, I will give you one of mine. We are no longer two separate beings, Cyrus. We are a closed loop. He leaned in, his lips hovering just a breath away from mine. The world thinks we are a king and his consort. They don't realize we are a parasite and its host, keeping each other from collapsing into the dark. Our moment was shattered by a sudden, jarring psychic scream. It wasn't a sound, but a jagged mental intrusion that made Alaric flinch and snarl, his violet eyes flashing. "Sire!" The doors to the throne room burst open. It was a messenger, but not one of ours. He was dressed in the tatters of the Southern Coalition's high uniform, but his skin was a sickly, translucent gray. His eyes were missing, replaced by smooth, scarred skin. "The Maw," the messenger croaked, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over stone. "The Maw has opened." Alaric stepped in front of me, his psychic aura expanding like a protective shield. "Who sent you? Speak, or I will peel your mind apart layer by layer." The messenger laughed, a horrific, rattling sound. "You cannot read what isn't there, cursed king. We are the hallowed. We are the ones who were left behind when the dragons died. And we have come for the voice." Before Alaric could react, the messenger's body began to vibrate. Not with muscles, but with a sound. A low-frequency hum that bypassed the ears and hit the soul. It was a counter-frequency, an anti-voice. I felt it like a physical blow. The void in my chest roared, trying to pull me toward the messenger. It was as if he were a magnet for my very existence. "Cease!" I spoke the word with everything I had. The messenger didn't just stop. He disintegrated into a cloud of gray ash. But the vibration didn't stop. It hung in the air, a lingering poison that made Alaric drop to his knees, clutching his head. "Alaric!" I scrambled to him, wrapping my arms around his shoulders. "Cyrus, get out." His voice echoed in my head, distorted and weak. "They are neutralizing the psychic plane. It's a dead zone. I can't protect you." "I don't need protection," I hissed, looking at the ash on the floor. The Maw wasn't a person. It was an ancient cult of survivors from the era of the dragon speakers. They were the ones who had perfected the art of hunting my kind. They didn't have wolves. They didn't have minds. They were empty vessels, designed to absorb the voice until the speaker was nothing but dust. And they were coming for the obsidian spire. By noon, the horizon was no longer black volcanic stone. It was a sea of gray. The Maw's army didn't march. They drifted. Thousands of sightless, hollowed warriors approached the city walls. They didn't carry swords. They carried resonance bells, massive tuning fork-like structures that hummed with that same deadly, soul-eating frequency. The city's defenses were useless. Alaric's psychic legions were collapsing. Every time one of his warriors tried to project their mind, the resonance shattered their consciousness. The obsidian spire, the fortress that had never fallen, was being dismantled by a sound. "They want me," I said, standing on the battlements next to Alaric. He looked terrible. His violet eyes were dim, and blood was leaking from his nose. The resonance was a direct attack on his psychic nature. He was a creature of high-frequency mind power. The low-frequency Maw was his literal poison. "I won't let them have you," Alaric growled, his hand gripping the stone railing so hard it cracked. "I will burn this entire city to the ground before I let them touch you." "If you burn the city, they win," I said, looking out at the gray tide. "They are here to feed. My voice is the only thing that can satisfy them, and it's the only thing that can destroy them. But I can't do it alone, not against this many." I turned to him, taking his hand. "Alaric, I need you to do something impossible. I need you to open your mind completely to me. No shields, no barriers. I need to use your psychic energy as a conductor. I need to turn the entire city into a megaphone for the voice." Alaric's eyes widened. "Cyrus, if I do that, if we bridge that deeply, our souls will fuse. There will be no you and me anymore. We will be a single entity. If one of us dies, the other vanishes. Then we live or die as one, I said. Are you afraid, King? Alaric looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something human behind the violet light. Not a king, not a monster, but a man who was terrified of being alone again. I've been waiting for someone to be brave enough to ask, he whispered. We stood at the very peak of the spire, the wind whipping our hair. The Grey Army was at the gates. The sound of the resonance bells was a physical weight now, cracking the glass of the palace windows, making the stones of the tower groan in agony. Alaric stood behind me, his arms wrapped around my waist, his forehead pressed against the back of my neck. Open, he commanded mentally. I felt it. It was like a sun exploding inside my skull. Alaric's mind, 10,000 years of history, millions of voices, the cold beauty of the cosmos flooded into me. I saw the birth of the first wolf. I saw the fall of the last dragon. I felt his love for me, a violent, possessive, and sacrificial fire that burned away every doubt I had. And in return, I gave him my voice. Our energies spiraled together, violet psychic light intertwining with the invisible tectonic power of the dragon speaker. We weren't a man and a king anymore. We were a storm. I looked out at the thousands of gray warriors below. I opened my mouth, but I didn't speak with my vocal cords. I spoke with the combined soul of the obsidian throne. Dissonance. The word didn't travel through the air. It traveled through the psychic plane Alaric had laid out for me. It hit every single one of the hollowed warriors at once. The resonance bells didn't just stop. They shattered. The gray warriors, who had spent centuries being empty, were suddenly filled with more power than they could contain. They began to glow with a violet light, their translucent skin tearing as the voice vibrated through their very atoms. But the maw wasn't finished. From the back of the army, a figure rose. He was massive, draped in robes of human skin, carrying a staff topped with a dragon skull. The high priest of the maw. The voice is ours, he roared, and his voice was a vacuum. He began to suck the energy back in, drawing the power I had unleashed into his staff. He was a black hole, and he was pulling at the bridge between Alaric and me. I felt Alaric scream in my head. He was being drained. His life force, his memories, his very essence was being pulled toward the priest. Cyrus. Stop. It's too much. He's taking me. No, I hissed. He's not taking anything. I realized then that I had been using the voice all wrong. I had been using it to command others. I needed to use it to command us. I reached back, grabbing Alaric's hands, pulling him even closer until there was no space between our bodies. I focused on the hollow in my chest, the void that had been eating my soul. I stopped trying to fill it. I opened it wide. Consume. The command wasn't directed at the priest. It was directed at the void within myself. Suddenly, the flow reversed. I became the black hole. I began to pull the energy back from the priest, but I didn't stop there. I pulled the essence of the Grey Army. I pulled the resonance of the bells. I pulled everything that was empty and hollow into the void of my own soul. It was agony. It felt like my skin was being turned inside out. But Alaric was there, his mind a fortress of iron, holding my consciousness together, refusing to let me scatter into the wind. The high priest's eyes widened. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He was being erased. His staff crumbled. His robes vanished. The entire Grey Army was being inhaled by the Null Omega they had come to feed upon. Within seconds, the horizon was empty. The gray tide was gone. The resonance was silent. I collapsed. The connection between Alaric and me snapped like a taut wire. The sudden silence in my head was deafening. I fell toward the stone floor, but Alaric caught me. Both of us sliding to our knees in the ruins of the battlements. I couldn't feel my legs. I couldn't feel my arms. When I looked at my hands, they were as pale as marble, and my veins were no longer black. They were a faint, glowing violet. "Cyrus, Cyrus!" Alaric was shaking me, his face a mask of horror. I tried to speak, but my throat was closed. I had used too much. The toll had been paid in full. I felt the last of my memories, the memory of my own name, the memory of my first book, starting to flicker and die. No. Alaric's voice roared in my mind, a desperate, frantic psychic command. "I will not let you go. Take it. Take all of it." He began to force his own memories into the gaps. I saw his coronation. I saw the face of his mother. I saw the first time he looked at me in the library. He was giving me himself to keep me from becoming a vacuum. "Stop," I managed to whisper, my voice a broken rasp. You'll have nothing left." "I have you," he whispered back, his violet eyes weeping blood. "That is the only thing I need to remember." We sat there in the dawn light, two broken gods clutching each other in the silence. The city below was beginning to wake up, unaware that their world had almost ended. I looked at Alaric and realized that I didn't know who I was anymore. My past was a blur of his memories and my own. I was a hybrid, a dragon speaker built from the mind of a cursed king. But as he leaned down and finally pressed his lips to mine, a new memory formed, one that didn't belong to the past. It was the taste of ozone, the feeling of safety, and the realization that the voice didn't have to be a tragedy. It could be a song. "The final move. They will come again," Alaric said hours later as we stood in the restored throne room. He was weaker now, his psychic range halved, his violet eyes permanently dimmed. I was different too. My hair had turned stark white, and my eyes had taken on a faint violet rim. "Let them come," I said. I felt a new kind of power humming in my blood. It wasn't the hollow hunger of before. It was something stable, something shared. "We have a problem, Cyrus," Alaric said, looking at a map of the continent. The Maw was just the beginning. The other packs, they saw what you did. They saw the Null Omega destroy an army. They are terrified, and terrified alphas do only one thing. They unite, I finished. "They have formed the Grand Hunt," Alaric said. 5 kingdoms, 200,000 alphas. They are marching on the Obsidian Spire. They say they are coming to liberate the world from the monsters on the throne. I looked at the map. I looked at the vast armies of the world turning against us. I felt the voice vibrating in my chest, no longer a burden, but a sharpened blade. "They think we are monsters?" I asked, a cold, beautiful smile spreading across my face. I walked to the throne, the massive obsidian seat that had belonged to Alaric's bloodline for 1,000 years. I didn't sit in the consort's chair. I sat on the throne itself. Alaric didn't protest. He stood beside me, his hand on my shoulder, his mind locking with mine. "Let's show them what happens when the monsters stop hiding," I said. I leaned forward, my voice carrying to every corner of the palace, every guard in the city, and every spy hiding in the shadows. "Invite them." The command echoed through the world. It wasn't an act of war. It was a summons. The stage was set. The voice and the mind were ready. And the Grand Hunt was about to find out that they weren't the hunters. They were the tribute. The arrival of the Grand Hunt. The sky above the Obsidian Spire was no longer violet. It was choked with the dust of 10,000 marching boots and the suffocating, oily scent of alpha aggression. The Grand Hunt had arrived. From the balcony of the throne room, I watched the horizon. 5 kings, each leading their elite legions, had encircled the city. Their banners, wolves of gold, iron, and blood, snapped in the wind. They had come to purify the world. They had come to kill the abomination and the traitor king. They look so small from up here, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper, yet it vibrated the glass of the window. Alaric stood behind me, his hands resting on my shoulders. His touch was no longer cold. It was a constant, pulsing stream of psychic warmth. We were no longer two people. We were a binary star system. I could feel his heartbeat in my own chest. I could see the tactical formations of the enemy through his psychic eyes, mapped out in glowing lines of intent and malice. They are afraid, Cyrus. Alaric's voice echoed in the cavernous halls of my mind. They have brought every silver blade and every anti-magic charm they could find. They think this is a war of steel. Let them think that, I said, leaning back into his embrace. It's time to show them that the wolf was only a guest in this world, and their stay is over. The parley of fools. I didn't wait for them to breach the gates. I didn't send out an army to meet them. I walked out of the spire alone. I wore no armor, no crown, and no weapons. I was dressed in a simple white robe that flowed around me like smoke. My hair, now as white as a dead star, was loose. My eyes, rimmed with the violet fire of Alaric's soul, scanned the sea of alphas as the gates of the city groaned open. The army stopped. A ripple of confusion went through the ranks. They had expected legions of silent sentinels. They had expected psychic lightning. They didn't expect a single wolfless Omega walking calmly into the center of their killing field. "Stop!" a voice roared. 5 men on horseback rode forward. At the center was Lord Vance of the Ironbite Pack, the man the Silver Moon Alphas had tried to sell me to. He was a mountain of a man, scarred and bloated with pride, his alpha aura so thick it felt like a physical sludge. "Cyrus," Vance sneered, his horse dancing nervously as it approached me. The animal had more sense than the man. It could smell the void in me. "I see the cursed king has turned you into quite the little pet. You've traded your books for silk, but you still smell like a Null." I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I felt no anger. I felt only a profound, distant pity. "Lord Vance," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it silenced the restless murmurs of the 10,000 soldiers behind him. "You've come a long way to claim a bride who doesn't exist." "I've come to claim your head," Vance roared, drawing a massive silver claymore. "And the head of your puppet king. The Council of Kings has declared you a blight on the bloodlines. You have used forbidden arts to humiliate alphas. You have subverted the natural order." The other 4 kings nodded, their faces masks of righteous fury. "The natural order," I repeated, a small smile playing on my lips. "You mean the order where the strong devour the weak? The order where a wolf's growl is the only law? That isn't nature, Vance. That's just a cage you built for yourselves." "Enough!" another king shouted, his hand gripping his sword. "Where is Alaric? Is he hiding behind your skirts? Does he not have the courage to face the hunt?" "Alaric is exactly where he needs to be," I said. "I am here," Alaric's voice boomed, "not in my head, but in the minds of every single soldier in the valley." The horses reared. Men fell to their knees, clutching their heads as the king of the Obsidian Spire unleashed a psychic wave of such pure, unfiltered power that the very air began to glow. Alaric stepped out from the shadows of the gate, his violet eyes blinding. But he didn't attack. He walked over to me and stood at my side, his hand interlaced with mine. "You speak of the hunt," Alaric said, his voice a psychic thunder. "But you are not the hunters. You are the livestock that has forgotten its place." "Kill them!" Vance screamed, his face purple with rage. "Kill them both, now!" The song of the end, the grand hunt, charged. 10,000 alphas, driven by the biological compulsion to destroy anything that threatened their dominance, surged forward. It was a wave of steel and fur, a tidal wave of violence that should have crushed us in a heartbeat. Alaric looked at me. "Are you ready?" "I have been ready since the first day they called me a Null," I replied. I closed my eyes. I didn't reach for the voice to make them kneel. I didn't reach for it to kill. I reached for the core of the world. I reached for the ancient, sleeping essence of the dragons that had once shared their souls with humanity. I felt Alaric's mind wrap around mine, magnifying my power 1,000-fold. We were a lens, and the voice was the sun. I opened my mouth and I didn't speak a word. I sang a note. It was a sound that had not been heard on this earth for 10 millennia. It was the frequency of the stars. It was the vibration of the soul before it is born into a body. Awaken! The command didn't hit their bodies. It hit their wolves. The 10,000 alphas froze mid-charge. But they didn't fall. They began to scream, not in pain, but in terror. Inside each of them, the beast they had used to justify their cruelty, the wolf that gave them their rank and their power, was being unmade. I wasn't stripping them of their power this time. I was evolving it. I watched as Lord Vance fell from his horse. His body began to shift, but not into a wolf. His skin glowed with a pale, translucent light. The aggression, the territorial hunger, the biological drive to dominate, it was being burned away by the voice. What are you doing to us? Vance wheezed, his claymore falling from his limp fingers. I am freeing you, I said, my voice resonating through every soul in the valley. The wolf was a parasite. It made you strong, but it made you monsters. I am taking back the gift. I am making you human again. One by one, the 10,000 soldiers stopped being alphas. The command in their blood vanished. The hierarchy that had ruled the world for centuries, Alpha, Beta, Omega, dissolved in the wake of the voice. They stood in the mud, thousands of men and women looking at their hands in confusion. The scent of power was gone. The valley smelled of nothing but the earth and the rain. The 5 kings were the last to change. They fought it the hardest, their pride clinging to the beast within. But the voice was absolute. I watched as the red fire in Vance's eyes died out, replaced by a hollow human gray. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't see an Omega. He saw a man, and he was terrified. The throne of the new world. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. The grand hunt was over. There were no more alphas to lead, and no more omegas to follow. There was only a broken, humbled mass of people who had forgotten how to live without a beast to tell them what to do. Alaric and I stood on the hill, looking down at the ruins of the old world. It's done, Alaric said aloud. His violet eyes were still bright, but the jagged, cruel edge of his power had softened. He was no longer a king of shadows. He was something else entirely. The world will hate us, I said, leaning my head against his shoulder. They will call us the Great Erasers. They will tell stories of the day the voice stole their strength. Let them, Alaric said, pulling me closer. They have their lives. They have their choices. For the first time in history, they are responsible for their own souls. We turned back toward the obsidian spire. It was no longer a fortress. It was a lighthouse. In the weeks that followed, the borders of the kingdoms collapsed. Without the alpha instinct to conquer, the war simply stopped. People began to travel. They began to learn. The libraries I had loved so much were suddenly filled with former warriors, men like Vance who were trying to find a purpose in a world where they couldn't just take what they wanted. I remained the voice. Alaric remained the mind. We sat on the throne together, but we didn't issue commands. We listened. We held the balance. When the hollowing tried to take a piece of me, Alaric was there to fill the gap. When the millions of human voices became too loud for his head, I spoke the word that brought him peace. The final entry years later, I sat in the royal gardens, a place that was now lush with green things, grown from the song of the voice. I was writing in a new journal, my fingers still stained with that familiar blue gall ink. I am Cyrus. I have no wolf. I have no rank. My hair is the color of the moon, and my soul is a tapestry of 1,000 years of someone else's memories. I have died a dozen deaths in the void, and I have been reborn a dozen times in the arms of a king who became my equal. The world is quiet now. The age of the wolf is a legend told to children to warn them of the dangers of pride. The age of the voice is a mystery that most people are content to leave alone. I looked up as Alaric walked through the garden. He looked older, more human, but his eyes still held that violet spark. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. "Are you coming to bed, my dragon?" his mind whispered. I closed the book and stood up. I looked at the obsidian spire, rising high into a sky that was finally clear. "I'm coming," I said. My voice was soft. It didn't shake the earth. It didn't shatter glass. It was just a human voice, speaking to the person he loved. And in the end, that was the most powerful command of all. The age of the wolf is dead. The age of the voice has begun. Cyrus and Alaric proved that a soul isn't measured by its teeth, but by its will. Thank you for staying until the very end of this journey. It's been an epic road from that dusty library to the obsidian throne, and I'm so glad you were here to witness it. I have one question for you. If you had the ancient voice, what would be the very first command you gave to the world? Drop your answers in the comments below. I'll be reading and hearting the best ones. If you loved seeing a Null scholar become a god, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss our next story. I'm Aether, and remember, silence isn't weakness. It's just a command waiting to be spoken. See you in the next one.